Okay. Let's do another weight and balance, another type. I want you to go back to page 69, and we're going to do a super easy one. We're going to do a super easy one here. This is the type they have for Cessna. This is extra easy. Here we have an airplane, a sample airplane, weighs 1306. We're going to put oil in it that weighs 15 pounds. We're going to put full tanks in it. The plane only holds 38 gallons, so that's going to be 228 pounds. We've got two standard FAA passengers. FAA says a standard passenger is 170 pounds, so we'll put two FAA guys in the front seat, two FAA guys in the back seat. We got 71 pounds of baggage. Our total weight so far is 2,300 pounds. We're legal. Now, we're legal on weight so far. To determine if we're within balance, Cessna has an extra easy way of doing this. Take a look up here. We're going to use a graph on the next page to figure out what are called moment indexes. Then we're going to add up all those moment indexes, which are actually moments slash 1,000, and we're going to plot out those 2 points right here. We're going to plot out the intersection of 102.4 and 2,300 pounds, plot out the intersection. And as long as the intersection is anywhere within this envelope, we're considered to be within limits. This envelope is an envelope of pre-divided numbers that come within limits, that fall within limits. Okay? Now, let's see how we figure this. We had fuel that weighed 228 pounds. So what I want you to do is I want you to go up the side here until we get to 228 pounds. Here's 200, 210, 220, 228. And I want you to come across until you intersect the line that says fuel, 6 pounds per gallon. From this point, I want you to go straight down to the bottom and read what the moments are. The moments may be about 10.9. So that'd be about 10.9 moments. Okay. Look at there. They even made a little mark here for where 38 gallons is. That's because the plane oftentimes goes out with full tanks. All right. Now, let's go to the next number. The next number had the pilot and passenger weighing 340 pounds. Let's use 340 pounds. Let's go to the loading graph for 340 pounds. There's 340. Go straight across until we hit the line that says pilot and passenger. Go straight over and then down to the bottom, and it's somewhere around 12 and a half or thereabouts. Somewhere around 12 and a half. However, the manufacturer is a little more accurate with it, and he says that that's actually 12.6. So we do that for all of these numbers. Now, we add up the weights and we add up the moments. Now take a look up here, class. In this particular airplane, the oil is shown as a negative moment. You might wonder, how can that be? The reason is, take a look over here, on this particular airplane, the oil is ahead of the datum. So it gives it a negative arm. A negative arm times a positive weight is a negative moment. Okay? Anyway, we add up the weights and we add up the moments. Naturally, we add this number as any negative number by subtracting it. So with the total weights and the total moments, we now go over here and we plot their intersection on this graph. And if we're anywhere within this envelope, these are pre-divided numbers, we're within limits. Any question on that? Now, take a look up here. If we happen to fall in the utility category, that's good. That's just better. You might see a little placard on your airplane that says that intentional spins are prohibited unless you're loaded in the utility category. The plane's more stable in the utility category. Okay, so this is an envelope of pre-divided numbers that fall within limits. Okay? Alrighty. I want to talk to you about regulations right now. I want to talk to you about regulations. I want to tell you to open up your yellow books to page 2. Page 2 in your yellow books, please. Page 2 in your yellow book. Now, class, let me show you this. First of all, we've got really 3 sections of the regulations I want to talk to you about. One section is Part 61, shown here on page 2. Notice at the top of this it says, Part 61, Certification, Pilots and Flight Instructors. This has to do with rules about, how many hours you have to get your private license, and rules about carrying your license and your medical. These are certification rules. We're also going to talk about another part in just a bit, that is the general operating and flight rules. These are the rules that have to do with, the rules of right-of-way, like if you see the Goodyear blimp coming, who has a right-of-way, things like that. And we're going to take a minute to touch on National Transportation and Safety Board Part 830, which have to do with the rules pertaining to accidents, incidents, and overdue aircraft. That won't take but a minute to talk about that. Now, let's go back to where we were on page 2. I'm going to just explain these to you briefly, and I'm not going to go over them in great detail. There are some notes that I have already written out for you over there on the right-hand side. Those are sort of personal interpretations as to what this means. You also have your special appendix. Let's take a look at your special appendix for a minute, if you will, with me. On page 53 of your special appendix, I'd like you to notice what it says here. These are the actual regulations that come right from the test. So if we want to prepare for the test, we could just go over those only. But I'm going to cover more than just those. This is on page 53 of your special appendix book. You may care to follow along with me. And if you feel like something needs to be explained a little bit better, you might want to look at that special appendix and see if they even ask about it on the test. I'm going to explain things, what I think could be good, better than they show here. But there's certain things I want you to understand, and I'm going to explain to you much more than you have to know for the test. Okay, take a look up here, class. First of all, Regulation 61.3 tells us a couple things. First thing I want you to know that it says you have to have both your pilot license and your FAA medical in your personal possession whenever you're acting as pilot in command or any other required pilot flight crew member. All right? That's what I want you to know. You have to have that in your personal possession, both your license and your medical. Now, right now, if you're a student pilot, you have your student pilot license, and it happens you have a combination medical where the medical is a separate sheet. Correction, it's the same sheet. It's both the license and medical on the same piece of paper on flip sides. Once you get your private license, you'll have one sheet that's your private pilot license and one sheet that's your medical. You have to carry both of those whenever you're acting as pilot in command or any other required pilot flight crew member. Okay, I want to take a minute down here on 61.5, and it tells you about the ratings that'll be on your license. For instance, you'll be rated to fly an airplane, which is a category. See, a certain category rating you'll have as airplane, and you'll also be rated for a class, such as single-engine land. One reason why I want to point this out now is in just a little while I'm going to tell you that in order to carry passengers, you have to be current in the same category and class of airplane, category and class of aircraft. And the category would be airplane, and class would be single-engine land. Right? Now tell me this, class. Would it be correct to say that any airplane that has one engine and wheels would be in the same category and class? Would that be correct? No. Yes, it would. They're both airplanes, and they're both single-engine land airplanes. So class is single-engine land. So would it be correct then to say that a Beechcraft Bonanza that has retractable landing gear, a high-performance engine, and flaps and a controllable pitch propeller is the same category and class as a little Cessna 152? Yep. Yes, it is. They're both single-engine land airplanes. So any airplane with one engine and wheels is in the same category and class. When you get your private pilot license, you're going to be licensed for category and class. Okay? So you'll be licensed to fly any airplane with one engine and wheels. We'll learn later that to fly high-performance airplanes, you need at least a one-time endorsement showing you're competent in those planes, but that's something we'll talk about later. Over on the next page, 6123 talks about the medical certificates. And I want to tell you that you have to have, if you want to be a private pilot, at least a Class 3 medical certificate. There's 3 classes, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. You need to only have a Class 3. Now, professional pilots have to have a Class 2, and airline pilots have to have a Class 1. But you need only have a Class 3 medical. Now, the thing that can be confusing here is the expiration date of these. Take a look over here, class. These are valid for 24 calendar months, as we say. Now, what's a calendar month? Well, that's a month till the end of the month, all right? That's a month till the end of the month. 24 calendar months, all right? So take a look up here. That means if a medical was issued to you, for instance, make it on June the 10th or June the 22nd, it makes no difference. These expire at the end of June, June the 30th, 2 years later. They're always good until the end of the month, all right? That's what we mean by a calendar month. But anyway, that's the expiration date of a medical. Every FAA test I've ever taken, up through and including air transport rating, flight instructor, commercial instrument, all of those ratings always had a question about the medical. So you might as well know this is a giveaway, all right? This is on the test for sure. All right, I'm going to shut off the slides here for a while. I don't use the slides for a while now, and I just sort of prefer to just talk to you directly. So what I want to, and I'll have these back on in a bit, but I want to talk to you just for a minute here about Regulation 6151. Regulation 6151, pilot logbooks. This tells you that you have to log only two types of flight time. The flight time that you want to count towards a higher rating, and the flight time that you need to show recent flight experience. In other words, if you have all the licenses you want, you don't have to log any more flight time to get more licenses. You don't want to log it. You don't have to log all your flights. If you take a flight and you get lost and end up having to land at Houston County, Tennessee somewhere or something like that, and you don't want to put that in your logbook, you don't have to put that in your logbook. You don't have to keep a record of your flight time except the time that you want to count towards a higher rating, or the time that you want to use to show recent flight experience. We're going to learn in just a minute that in order to carry passengers, you have to have done 3 bounces in the last 90 days, all right? Well, you have to have that logged in your logbook if you want to carry passengers. Okay, let's go over here to Regulation 6157 on the next page, and this tells us about that recent flight experience requirement. Take a look up here. Take a look up here. Okay, Regulation 6157 is always the subject of FAA oral exams to be a private pilot. It's always asked of you. 6157, and by the way, you don't have to learn these numbers, all right? Paragraph A tells us about something called a flight review. And it tells us that this is required in order to simply act as pilot in command. If you want to fly as pilot in command,
you have to have done one of the following 2 things within the previous 24 calendar months. And these are months till the end of the month, just like the medicals are to the end of the month. So if you took your private pilot check on June 15th of this year, you are legal to act as pilot in command until June 30th, 2 years later.
And within the previous 2 years, you must have completed either one of the following 2 things. You have to have either completed a pilot proficiency check conducted by the FAA for some operating privilege. Like maybe you took your private pilot flight check. Maybe you took a multi-engine flight check. Maybe you took an instrument flight check. If you've done one of those in the last 2 years, you can go act as pilot in command today. But if you get your private license and now you don't take any more flight checks because you're not working on your instrument rating or anything else, then at the very minimum, what you're going to have to do within the previous 2 years, and you want to go flying today, you have to have your logbook endorsed by a flight instructor, any flight instructor, who certifies your logbook that you are competent in, certifies your logbook that you have completed the flight review required by Regulation 6157. Now, on this check that he gives you, any instructor, you can just go to any instructor and say, you know, I got my private license almost 2 years ago, and I'm not taking any more training for any new ratings. I guess I'm going to need my flight review to fly as pilot in command. He say, yes, that's correct. And this instructor, he can ride along with you, and he observes you in your flying technique, and he determines that he thinks you're safe enough. And then he's supposed to give you a little oral exam. The subject of it is supposed to be talking about new things. For instance, he would surely ask you about ARSAs. That's a new thing. He would probably ask you about the requirements for transponders in terminal control areas, which is kind of new for Group 2 terminal control areas especially. So he would ask you about that. He would ask you about updating things. Now, if he feels you did all right, he endorses your logbook that you have satisfactorily completed this requirement. If he feels you haven't done it good enough, he'd say, well, I'm afraid that I've check-ridden you, and I'm sorry, but you're not really acceptable. You're not too bad, but you're not good enough. And he says, he can't put in your logbook, you flunk. He can't do that. All he can do is say, I can't endorse you for satisfactorily completing this. And he can say, now, of course, you could probably get up to speed with about another 20 hours of instruction. And he says, I'm just the man that could take care of that for you, all right? Sure, they only charge $50 an hour, you know. No, I'm just kidding. Chances are they would endorse your logbook okay if you did a decent job. It's not really too bad. They endorse your logbook, and now you're ready to fly as pilot in command again for 2 more years. Okay? Now, you have to have this done if you're not working on any more ratings. Now, some people have never had a flight review given by an instructor. Some people get their private, their instrument, then their multi-engine, get their flight instructor rating, and then they, of course, flight instructors have to take these checks, but then maybe he gets a job with the airlines, and he takes a check ride every 6 months for the airlines, a pilot proficiency check conducted by the FAA. And then he never has to have a flight review by Joe Flight Instructor. All right? He doesn't have to have that. As long as within the previous 2 years you've taken this check ride, a pilot proficiency check or a check ride by an instructor, then you're legal. Okay, this is a requirement to act as pilot in command. Paragraph C has to do with carrying passengers. And this has to do with category and class. Category and class. And here's what this says. If you want to carry passengers within the previous 90 days, see, it's more restrictive for carrying passengers. If you want to carry passengers within the previous 90 days, you must have done 3 takeoffs and 3 landings as the sole manipulator of the controls, and they must be done in the same category and class of aircraft. So tell me this, class. If you want to fly a Cherokee 140, and you haven't flown a Cherokee 140 forever, for that matter, but and you've flown other airplanes that are single-engine airplanes, could you carry passengers in a Cherokee 140? Yes. Yes, you could. According to this regulation, you could. Now, if you got in it and you didn't know how to work all the faucets and the engine quit and had an accident, they'd say you were careless and reckless to get in a plane you had never flown before and carrying passengers. But as long as you're current in any single-engine land airplane, then you're legal to fly any single-engine land airplane and carry passengers. As long as within the previous 90 days you have done 3 takeoffs and 3 landings as the sole manipulator of the controls. These landings need not be full-stop landings. These landings could be touch and goes. That's all right. There is an exception, though, if the airplane is a tailwheel airplane. If it's a tailwheel airplane, which is conventional gear, then that must be to a full stop.
What?
Okay? Yes?
Why do they call a tailwheel conventional?
The question is, why do they call a tailwheel conventional and nose wheel tricycle?
Right.
Well, because they first had the tailwheel airplanes. Those were the first ones. See, everybody had those. There was no such thing as a nose wheel airplane, a tricycle here. That didn't exist. So that was the conventional airplane. Then they had these radical ones with nose wheels. See, those were the radical ones. Now, of course, it's the other way around almost, isn't it?
It just depends on when it come out.
Yeah, right, right. Okay. All right. Tell me this, class. I got a question for you. Before I erase this, I'll ask you this. Suppose you're an airline captain and you fly 727s. And you fly all the time. You fly 60, 80 hours a month. And, well, not that much, 30 hours a month. Okay, so anyway, you fly your 35 hours a month or whatever. And you also own a Cessna 172. You keep it tied down in the mud. And you want to go out and fly, and you haven't flown your 172 for about 4 months. Could you fly that 172 and take passengers up? No. Well, yeah, you have a single engine rating. Yeah, you have a single engine rating, but it's your airplane. You just haven't flown it for 4 months. Could you carry passengers? No, because you have to have 3 takeoffs and landings in the previous 90 days. Could you get in that plane yourself and go fly solo 3 takeoffs and landings and get legal? Sure you could. Okay, so if you had your friends come out there and your friends wanted to help you pull the airplane out of the mud, so only take them for a ride, you say, listen, you guys have to wait a minute, I got to get some practice. They say, well, I'm all for practice, all right? So now you go out, you do your 3 takeoffs and landings. Now, if you come in on that first one, you come in and you maybe hit the nose wheel and bounce the thing up. Then you come back again, and this time you hit it and go bang. And the next one, you pretty well run out of speed, and you come down, plop. That's 3. 1, 2, 3, all right? Now, it doesn't say anything about going around the pattern, all right? So I guess you're legal. 3 takeoffs and landings, see? Just put that in your logbook. 3 takeoffs and landings, all right? I wouldn't, well, keep a straight face when you put it in the logbook. If somebody's asking you about it, be sure you keep a straight face. Now, it doesn't say you have to go around a pattern. So maybe you might say 3 takeoffs and landings, or maybe 1 real bad one to do the job, all right? But I don't think the intent of the regulation is that you make 1 bad one. I think I'd go around a pattern. That's what I do. If I made such a bad one, I think I'd go back and do 3 real takeoffs and landings. Okay? All right. Now, there's another paragraph here, paragraph D. It has to do with night flying. Paragraph D says that if you want to carry passengers at night, it says you must have done your 3 takeoffs and landings at night to carry passengers at night, right? And they must be in the same category and class. These landings must be done in the same category and class for night flying, okay? 3 takeoffs and landings, and they must be to a full stop. Those night landings must be full stoppers. Now, by the way, there's one thing that everybody always says is a loophole. It's not that big a deal. But the night landings would count for day landings. There's no requirement that says that day landings must be done in the daytime. It just said to carry passengers, you must have done 3 takeoffs and landings in the last 90 days. It says to fly at night, land at night, you must have 3 takeoffs and landings at night in the category and class. So there's no requirement that says anything has to be done in the daytime. Yes,
Your biannual flight review every 2 years, does that have to cover anything to do at night?
No, the instructor is not required to make you fly at night. No, not required. All he does is what he thinks is appropriate. Now, he may conduct it at night if that's the only time convenient, right? But it doesn't have to be at night. What they're trying to do on that biennial flight review class, what they're trying to do on that is eliminate a problem. Here's what the problem was. The problem was that somebody learned to fly once when he was 18 years old and a college student, or 20 when he was a college student. Later on, he got out of college, got married, had no money, all right? And didn't have any money for 10 years or 15 years. Now, all of a sudden, he's gotten a successful business, his kids are grown and so on, and he's got some spare money. And he wants to go out and fly. So he goes up to somebody and says, what do I have to do to be legal to fly? And they say, you got to have a medical. That's all he had to have was a medical. So he'd get a medical and he had his license, and he was legal by the FAA to go be a pilot in command. But he didn't know anything about a TERSA or an ARSA or a TCA or even what a transponder looked like, because they didn't have those 15 years ago. So the FAA says, we need a rule to prevent this problem. And that's when they came up with the rule about the biennial flight review. It said that if you got a guy that's not evidently taking check rides, getting his instant rate and so on, at the very minimum, he should at least take a check ride from some instructor. And the instructor's supposed to quiz him a little bit about the new rules and so on, as well as give him a flight check, sort of. And there was no provision for failing someone. He could just fail to endorse them successfully. Now, one more thing I want to mention about this night, all right? Here's what they're going to ask you on the test. Most regulations make sense. Most regulations are conservative. But the regulation I'm about to tell you about, and the one that's asked on the test, doesn't make sense, and it's not conservative. Let me explain it. Sunset is 1800, let's say. Sunrise is 0600. Now, when the FAA made this, considered what's night, they said, well, this is night, sunset to sunrise. But they said that we don't want anybody practicing night landings just after sunset, because it's not dark enough. We want it real dark. So they said, for the purpose of this regulation, night is 1900 to 0500. Says this is night. Okay, that's night. They said, yeah, we want it tough on those guys. We don't want anybody squeaking by at dusk. So a night landing, for the purpose of satisfying this regulation, must have been made during the time when it's real dark. But there's a bit of an oversight here. And that is, if you have someone that is not legal for night flying, he doesn't know how to fly at night, how late can he land that airplane if he doesn't know how to fly at night? He can land it all the way up till 1900. He might be flying with his passengers, and he starts descending. Passengers say, why are we descending? We still got 2 hours to go to our destination. He said, well, I don't know how to land at night. Don't know how to land at night? What? It's dark already. No, it's not dark for 30 minutes, according to the FAA. See, so I'm just pointing out to you, this will be on the test. The test question says, if you don't know how to fly at night, you're not legal for night, when must you land? And the answer here is 1900, 1 hour after sunset. Okay. Over on the next page, page 5, it talks about private pilot privileges and limitations. And then what it says here is that private pilots may not fly for compensation or hire. I just want you to know you can't get paid for your flying. Now, it says this includes solo flying of power line patrols, crop dusting, or towing banners. I had a few students in my classes have thought that one guy said, well, he says, I'm in the advertising business. Can't I do banners for people and tow banners? It was my own business? No. You can't be paid for your flying unless you have a commercial license. Now, there are some exceptions that have to do with flying that is incidental to a business or employment. Maybe you're showing property out in Apple Canyon Valley or somewhere. You're going to fly them out there rather than drive them in your 88 Oldsmobile. That's okay, all right? If you're an aircraft salesman and you meet certain requirements, you can be sort of paid as a pilot, so to speak. And flying for a charitable organization is okay under certain requirements. You can also say, it says that a private pilot may share the operating expenses of a flight with his passengers. And it just means if someone buys you a sandwich or buys you dinner or something, that they can't be said that you're flying for hire, for example. Okay, I also want to talk to you real quickly about 9131 on the bottom of the page here. It talks about high-performance airplanes. What they want to do here is they want to try to save you from your own ego sometimes. It's a special rule that says that before you can fly a high-performance airplane, you must have a one-time endorsement in your logbook that you are competent in high-performance airplanes. What's a high-performance airplane, class? That's right. Basically, anything over 200 horsepower is high performance. Anything over 200 horsepower. But there are some planes that have 200 or less horsepower, and they have the following three things. They have retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller. If they have all three of those things, even though it's less than 200 horsepower, it's considered high performance. So you have to, if you want to fly, that would be something like a Cessna Cutlass RG. Those are 200 or less horsepower. You have to have a high performance endorsement to fly that airplane. Let me tell you what the FAA is after here. This is relatively new regulation. New like 1973. Okay, here's the rule. Here's the reasoning. It used to be people would get their private pilot licenses in a Piper Cub. Now, you know, years ago, by the way, people soloed in 6 hours. Nobody went more than 6 hours. Because you flew a plane with no electrical system in it, no flaps, and no radios. Oftentimes you flew on grass strips. All you had to do was get in that thing, give it the power, climb up, turn, go downwind. You only flew downwind at about 60 knots. Turn base and final, and land. There was no flaps, no nothing. Anybody could solo in 6 hours. Now, they had no electrical system, so there was no Hobbs meter in it. And everybody just logged their flight time, but from the time they took off till the time they landed. They didn't count that taxiing. That's why you hear about these people soloing in 6 hours a long time. But they weren't any better pilots. They were just flying simple airplanes, and they were keeping track of time by their watch from actual flight time. Well, once this pilot got his license, he could get his license without ever going to a controlled airport. There was no instruments in the airplane. You had no instrument training. Everybody got their license in 40 hours. So this pilot gets his license, and now he'd see an ad in the paper for a Beechcraft Bonanza. He'd go out and say, I'm interested in one of those Beechcraft Bonanzas. And, you know, he says, I'm a well-to-do person. I've made a lot of money in the commodities business. I've got $10 million. And he says, what does it take to get checked out in one of those Bonanzas? He said, let's check the regulations. Let's see. He says, regulations say all you need is certified check or cash. He says, cash will do it. You're checked out, my friend. He says, well, don't I need any special number of hours in this? No, it doesn't say anything about hours in a Bonanza or anything. No, you're legal. So sometimes some people believe this, you know. It's like that guy that wanted to come to my class and be an airline pilot in 2 days. If you told him he was ready, he'd get in that plane and take off, all right? So they give him he'd write a check for $150,000 for that Bonanza, get in that airplane, take off, and if he figured out how to get the wheels up, that was fine, but if they didn't come down, he forgot you had to put the wheels down to land. You know, anyway, invariably they got in accidents, many times serious accidents. So that's why the FAA made a rule here, and it said that if you want to act as pilot in command of a high-performance airplane, you have to at least one time have a one-time endorsement in your logbook by any flight instructor that you are competent to fly high-performance airplanes. And a high-performance airplane is any airplane greater than 200 horsepower, like a Cessna 182, or airplanes 200 or less horsepower with retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller. Moving on to Part 91, the General Operating and Flight Rules. And I'd like to tell you that we're just going to sort of, I'm going to explain these to you. You may again want to keep your special appendix out, kind of following along with what I'm talking about, because that's really what's on the test. We want to start out here on page 6 here, 91.3. It talks about the responsibility and authority of the pilot in command. Paragraph A says, the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and the final authority as to the operation of the aircraft. That's the basic law, and what that means is that whatever happens, it's your fault. Okay. That means that when a controller tells you you're cleared to land or something, he tells you cleared to land runway 36. If that runway is too short, you run off the end. If that runway has ice on it, and you slide off it. If you hit wake turbulence from an airplane on an intersecting runway or on a large airplane ahead of you, you should have asked for additional spacing. You should have asked for a longer runway. You should have inquired about ice on the runway. In other words, you're the one that's responsible for and the final authority as to the operation of the aircraft. If you're a student pilot and your instructor says, oh, you can handle that crosswind, I know you're okay, and you go out and bend that airplane, you can't say, well, my instructor, he's responsible for this because he told me to go flying. You're a student pilot right now, many of you, all of you, I believe, are student pilots just about. And whenever you fly that airplane, you are a licensed pilot. And you are directly responsible for and the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. Okay, now I want to tell you that there's a special rule that, as far as I know, is only true in aviation. It says, paragraph B says, in an emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot may deviate from any rule of this subpart or subpart B to the extent required to meet that emergency. Well, notice up in the top this says this is subpart A. Subpart B is just additional rules of the general operating rules. This doesn't say you can deviate from the rules of Part 61. Part 61 says you have to have an instrument rating to fly in instruments. You can't deviate from rules in Part 61. You can't deviate and say, well, I want to carry passengers as a student pilot. It was an emergency. All right? You can't do that. All right? But you can deviate from the rules of this part, Part 91, to the extent required to meet that emergency. Okay? Well, let me tell you a little bit about what this means. Let's say, for instance, you're at a place like O'Hare Airport. And let's suppose that you're on runway 27 left. You're going to take off on runway 27 left, and you're told in your terminal control area clearance to maintain runway heading, maintain 5,000 feet. Just as soon as you get in the air, your engine starts to run very rough. You look over at the oil pressure and you see it drop to 0. As soon as it drops to 0, you notice that oil starts coming out from underneath the cowling. You know you got a heck of an emergency, so you immediately put the plane into a bank to the right and you land on runway 32 left at O'Hare. Are you a rule breaker? Did you break any rules? Yes, you broke 2 rules right off. First of all, you were supposed to maintain runway heading, but you deviated, you turned. Not only that, but you landed at the world's busiest airport on a runway without a landing clearance. Are you a rule breaker? Yeah. You're darn right you're a rule breaker. But I would say under the paragraph B, this was an emergency requiring immediate action. And you deviated from the rules to the extent required to meet that emergency. Now, anytime you're a rule breaker, you can expect that you may get an FAA violation. And it might be the FAA is going to want more comment on this because they might still plan on giving you an FAA violation. Paragraph C has to do with how they deal with rule breakers. Paragraph C says that says each pilot who deviates from a rule under paragraph B of this section, in other words, in an emergency, upon the request of the administrator, that's the man in Washington or his duly authorized representative, he said, upon the request of the administrator shall send a written report of that deviation to the administrator. So what this says is that you may have to write a report to the FAA explaining this deviation. Now, I just want you to know then that this is a report that's sent to the administrator, and this has to do with breaking rules. If you're a rule breaker, you may have to write a letter to the administrator. Now, just as a bit of advice, this seems to me to be a pretty obvious case of a serious emergency that caused you to break some rules, and you did everything you could do. You did everything right. There was nothing you could do different, and I don't think you'd get an FAA violation for this. But as a general rule, when you get a letter from the FAA inquiring about an incident, I suggest that you bring this to some aviation legal counsel and ask them what the situation is here. Because these violations are very serious, as I mentioned yesterday. And when they send you a letter, I have learned, I haven't had any experience with these letters, but I have learned from other people that when they send you this letter, that means that they're giving a lot of consideration towards giving you an FAA violation. And if you comment, oftentimes that comment will be used against you. So it's a good idea to get some counseling. I read of a case one time in the AOPA magazine of a pilot there was about 5 people that owned a plane in partnerships. And one of them went out and in the early morning he did some buzzing over his girlfriend's house or something like that. And someone turned him in for this. And the FAA got a hold of this and they decided, well, they better give a violation out for this. They weren't really sure which one of the partners was flying the airplane. They just figured it was a certain one of the ones. They sort of picked him out of a hat, but they figured it was this one, let's say his name was Joe. Well, they sent him a letter saying, we are investigating an incident that occurred on June 15th in which you were the pilot in command of so-and-so airplane. And it is believed there may have been a violation of Regulation 91.9, careless and reckless operation, and a few others they threw in there. They weren't really sure. They didn't have enough evidence to be sure this was the person. Well, he responded by letter real quick, said, I wasn't really flying that low. He just convinced him, I'm the guy you're looking for. All right? So what I say here is that any time you get a letter from the FAA investigating an incident that occurred on a certain date, they're giving a lot of consideration towards giving you a violation, and the comments you make may very likely be used against you. Right? So seek some legal counsel in this case. Okay, now I've talked about emergency authority here for rule breaking. I'd like to jump ahead a bit, and I'd like to talk about a regulation that sounds similar but is actually different, and that's over on page 9, Regulation 9175. I'd like you to go over to page 9, Regulation 9175, and this has to do with compliance with ATC clearances and instructions. This has to do with a little different kind of rule breaking. First of all, paragraph A tells us, looking at the little interpretation on the side, it says that except in an emergency, no pilot may deviate from an ATC clearance or instruction. In other words, you want to do what ATC tells you to do, and you can't deviate, but that only, of course, is true whenever you're in an area in which air traffic control is exercised, like in the TCA, or in the ARSA, in an airport traffic area. Then you must do what they say. However, paragraph C says, basically looking at my little notes there, it says, it is permitted to deviate from an ATC clearance or instruction only in emergency, and then only if the pilot notifies ATC immediately by a radio message. If you deviate, it's okay as long as you tell them you're deviating in an emergency. Now then, so it's okay. It's sort of on the one hand, you got to do what they say. On the other hand, you can do what you want as long as you tell them you're deviating. Now, it says you're not a rule breaker. If you tell them you're deviating, you're not a rule breaker. But if you deviate and you don't tell them, you're a rule breaker. Now, it says that if ATC gives a pilot priority, and notice that word is underlined, if ATC gives a pilot priority during his emergency, then a detailed report of that emergency must be sent to the ATC facility chief within 48 hours if requested. The idea is that if you were given priority, some other son of a gun was not given priority. And they might get a letter of inquiry from the person who was made to go around, for instance, and therefore the controller, he wants a letter from you explaining what your emergency was to sort of cover the controller. Let me give you an example of this, a practical example. Let's suppose we have a similar example of what we had at O'Hare. You're on runway 27 left. You're told again, maintain runway heading, maintain 5,000 feet. Just as you get in the air, your engine again starts running rough, the oil pressure drops to 0, and oil starts coming up from under the cowling. You happen to have a boom mic with a push-to-talk button, though, all right? So, since you have your one hand extends the landing gear to come in for a landing, the other hand says, O'Hare Tower, this is Bonanza 8 Mike Whiskey, I got an emergency. They say, November 8 Mike Whiskey, cleared to land on any runway. You bend it around and you land on runway 32 left. Are you a rule breaker now?
No.
No. Number one, you told them you were deviating. Number two, they cleared you to land. So it's totally different than the other situation when you were a rule breaker. However, just as you're flaring out on runway 32 left, you see a 747 at 200 feet on final for runway 14 right. That's the opposite end of the runway. And you hear him say, United Airlines Flight 2, go around. That's the Honolulu nonstop. 747 with 300 and some passengers on board. Well, the captain immediately looked down at his fuel gauges. He knows he's got an hour of reserve fuel, so he figures that's enough. He puts on the power and he says, Roger, taking it around. Now, he flies around for 15 minutes coming back, uses thousands of pounds of fuel and hundreds of dollars worth of fuel. Plus, he's burning into his reserves a little bit, somewhat endangering the safety of this flight a little bit, but within limits, he feels it's safe, so he goes around. Now, when he makes this go-around, he might have to make up a report, some kind of an irregularity report to United Airlines. United Airlines may follow that up with a letter to the O'Hare Tower chief about why you made this pilot go around. Why do you think that controller now wants to have a letter on file from you? He wants a letter within 48 hours, because you were given priority, telling him what the nature of your emergency was and so on. Okay? So, there's two kinds of emergencies. There's the rule breaker emergency. When you break rules, you write a letter to the administrator. That's the man in Washington or his duly authorized representative. And you may not want to write that under self-incrimination and so on, but get legal counsel. And then there's the other kind of emergency where you deviate from clearances. When you deviate from clearances, then you write a letter to the FAA facility chief, but only, let's circle that word there that I have underlined, when you're given priority. Circle that word priority. You only write the letter if you're given priority. Okay, now let's go back, if you will, back to page 6, and we'll continue on with some other rules that are important. 91.5 talks about pre-flight action. Now, here's a list of 5 things that you have to do by regulation prior to a flight. All right, now listen close. Listen closely. There are 5 things you have to do for a flight not in the vicinity of an airport. That's what they say, not in the vicinity of an airport. That means you're going to be sort of on a cross-country flight. If you're on a cross-country flight, there's 5 things you must specifically do by regulation. 3 of these are actual things that you should do, and on the airlines, we bring this with us as documentation on board just to prove we did them. Let me tell you the 3 things we bring with us and that you must do. it tells us right here. Looking at my notes to the side there, put a check by number 2, number 3, and number 5. These are things that we bring with us as actual documentation. Number 2 says, on page 6, says a check of weather reports and forecasts. You must check weather reports and forecasts. That's a regulation. You must check fuel requirements. You must check that. And on the airlines, we bring a computation with us, a hard copy computation of how much fuel is required for this flight. And number 5, a check of available runway lengths and distances required. We bring that computation with us on board the airlines also. Now, let me tell you about 2 other things you must do, which some people would call FAA catch-alls. This is designed so that they can always hang you, all right? Number 1 says that you must check all available information concerning that flight. Now, nobody knows what that is exactly, but you better check everything. Now, if you ever get involved in an incident or an accident somehow, and someone starts querying you a little bit about what did you check and what didn't you check, you just tell them you checked all available information. He says, well, can't you be more specific? Say no. That's all I checked. Say I checked all available information. That's what the regulations say I'm supposed to check, and that's what I checked. Okay? Now, also, number 4 is an FAA catch-all. It says alternatives available if the planned flight cannot be completed. And nobody knows exactly what this means. But it does say here, in my notes there, it says this does not say that an alternate airport must be named or even selected. There is no requirement to name an alternate airport. You must have an alternative plan of action. The idea would be this. Let's say, for instance, you were going into the Omaha area, and as you got near Omaha, it began to get cloudy beneath you. If you were to continue on top of those clouds without any plan of action where you could get down through those clouds, that would be illegal. Now, as long as you have enough fuel to get to Omaha, turn around, come back to where the hole was, get down there, and then continue on, you'd be legal. But you must have an alternative plan of action in case the planned flight cannot be completed for some reason. Okay, so 5 things we must do. These are regulations. These are what we must do. Now, notice down below that, there's a special rule that says that if you're just going to be in the pattern, which means that you're going to be in the vicinity of an airport, you must check 2 things. 2 of those 5. It says, if planning to remain in the vicinity of an airport, a pilot must check all available information concerning the flight and the runway lengths. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you a list of things, and I want you to tell me as I name these whether it's a regulation to do this or a good operating practice. All right? Is it a regulation or a good operating practice to close the door before you take off? Just a good operating practice. Is it a regulation that you make sure the fuel caps are locked and secure, or is that a good operating practice? Just a good operating practice. Is it a regulation that you check to be sure the logbooks are on board before you fly, or a good operating practice? No, it's not a regulation, because first of all, they're not even required to be on board, number 1, and you certainly don't have to check them, all right? How about this? We're going to learn later that you have to have 3 documents on board the airplane: airworthiness certificate, certificate of registration, and operating limitations. Is it required that you check these are on board before you fly, or a good operating practice? No, you don't have to check those. They have to be on board, but you don't have to check them, all right? Do you have to check to be sure your license is in your pocket before you go flying? No, it's a good operating practice, but it's not a regulation. Are you getting the message, class? If it isn't one of these 5 things, then it's a good operating practice. If it's one of these 5 things, it's a regulation. How about having a map with you on a cross-country flight? Is that a regulation or a good operating practice? Just a good operating practice. If it isn't one of these 5 things, it's just a good operating practice. Okay? How about this? Checking the weather reports and forecasts prior to your flight, not in the vicinity of an airport. Regulation. That's a regulation. How about checking the runway lengths for your flight? Is that a regulation or a good operating practice? That's a regulation. These are the only 5 regulations. Okay, 91.7 has to do with flight crew members at their stations. What this says is, number 1, flight crew members must be in their seats at all times. Takeoff, landing, cruise, and everything else, number 1. And number 2, they must keep their seat belts fastened at all times while they're in their stations. All right? Now, there are some exceptions. You're allowed to get out of your seat if it's in connection with the operation of the aircraft or in connection with your physiological needs. All right? Anyway, if you've been in a 152 Cessna and you've been getting up and going for a walk in the cabin, you're not supposed to do that anymore. All right? Stay in your seats. All right? Okay, now on the next page it talks about the requirements for passengers, and it tells us that the passengers must be in their seats at all times during takeoff and landing only. In cruise, they don't have to be in their they don't have to keep their seat belts fastened. All right, so basically in summary, it says here in summary during takeoff and landing, passengers and flight crew use seat belts. Other times, flight crew only must use seat belts. All right. So crew use them all the time, passengers during takeoff and landing. Also, it's a regulation that you tell all your passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Or you can put a little sign up telling them to fasten their seatbelts, that's all right. 91.9 class, they don't ask you about this on the test, but I'd be remiss in my duties if I didn't tell you that this is the most violated regulation of all. This is the FAA's greatest catch-all. Anytime you're given a violation, they always throw this one in for good measure. 91.9, no person may operate an aircraft in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of another. That's what it says. That's a catch-all. 91.11 has to do with liquor and drugs, all right? And this says that there is an FAR about drinking, and that is that you can't fly for 8 hours after consuming any alcohol, all right? So there's a rule of 8 hours from bottle to throttle, all right? Now, the good operating practice is 24 hours, but the regulation is 8 hours. Now, I don't know why, but they have a question on the test about carrying passengers who are intoxicated, all right? Now, basically, it is a little more liberal in a way than it is for automobiles. In an automobile, no one's allowed to have open liquor in the car. However, in an airplane, your passengers are allowed to have open liquor and have a drink or two, all right? But they're not allowed to become obviously intoxicated. That's where they draw the line, when they're obviously intoxicated. Now, I'd like to tell you that they ask you a question on a test, and it says, under what situation can you carry a person who is obviously intoxicated? I don't know why they have it on here, but the answer is if he's a medical patient, all right? So if you have someone who's intoxicated, obviously intoxicated, you want to take me to say, listen, I'm going to take you, but I want you to know something. You are a medical patient, all right? And then you can take him. That's what the rules say. If he's a medical patient under proper care, you can carry him. Okay, 91.22 has to do with fuel requirements, all right? That has to do with fuel requirements. Take a look up here. Take a look up here. Fuel requirements. I want to tell you this. The rule is 30 minutes for VFR day reserve and 45 minutes for VFR night. This is the reserve fuel. Right? Now I'm going to tell you something. What I want to tell you is this is nowhere near enough fuel. It isn't even close to enough fuel. I've been a professional pilot for 20 years, over 20 years, and I can tell you this. You wouldn't find me flying a VFR flight in a general aviation airplane with less than 1 hour reserve. I want 1 hour minimum reserve fuel. Okay. Let's talk about it a minute. Let's suppose I'm going to fly a flight from Chicago down here to Nashville. BNA, that's Nashville. And along the way, I'm going to pass Indianapolis. And I'm going to pass by Evansville, somewhere around here. This flight's going to take me 3 hours. I should be in Indianapolis in 1 hour, Evansville in 2 hours, and Nashville in 3 hours. I've got 4 hours of fuel on board, so by my standards, I'm okay. I've got 4 hours of fuel. It's a 3-hour flight. I've got 1 hour reserve. Now, what does a 1 hour reserve mean? Does that mean that's fuel to be used for extra headwinds? No. A 1 hour reserve, or any reserve fuel, whatever your reserve is, that's to be used for something unexpected when you get to your destination. You get there and you find out that all of a sudden you need a special VFR and you got to hold for 20 minutes. You get there and you get on final and you put down your landing gear and you find the one wheel won't go down. So now you've got to change some light bulbs. Or maybe you drop one of the bulbs when you're trying to change them. You get on final and you find out that some reason an aircraft ahead of you just spun off the runway right at the intersection and they closed the field and you got to go to another airport. That's what the reserve fuel is for. Or your gauges are all wrong. Or somehow you thought the plane was filled full, but it was actually had been flown by somebody on a test flight earlier that morning and you were missing 30 minutes and didn't know it. That's what that 1 hour reserve fuel is for. So what would you do then, class, if this came up? What if you were flying along and you made it to Indianapolis in 1 hour and 10 minutes? And when you made it to Evansville, it was 2 hours and 20 minutes. What would you do on this flight? The answer is you'd stop. There's no doubt in your mind. When you missed when you missed Indianapolis in 1 hour and 10 when you're 10 minutes late, you'd pretty well figure, well, unless something miraculous happens between here and Evansville, I'm stopping. When you get to Evansville and you find out that it's 2 hours and 20 minutes, if this keeps up, you're going to have 3 hours and 30 minutes used with 4 hours of fuel, leaving only a 30-minute reserve, which isn't enough. How much reserve did I say you need? 1 hour. 1 hour. On the airlines The airlines fly along with 3 professional pilots in the cockpit. They fly along with ground dispatchers keeping track of the weather at their destination and calling them up in flight on a little chime phone to tell them, say, I want to let you know that the weather at San Diego is not so good right now, Captain. The weather seems to have deteriorated a bit. They now have presently indefinite 200 feet ceiling, and visibility is a half mile. And it looks like it may go down. You may want to consider your options, such as stopping in Las Vegas for fuel. They got somebody keeping track of them. They got highly accurate fuel gauges, 3 professional pilots, the best weather system in the world.
And they require by regulation a 45-minute reserve, and the company gives their captains an extra 15 minutes fuel for safety. United calls this extra 15 minutes of fuel contingency fuel. So in effect, United carries a total of 1 hour of reserve fuel.
You want to tell me that a private pilot can go out in a 172 with radios that don't work worth a darn, with fuel gauges that don't work worth a darn, with performance numbers that are all fairy tales in your flight manual, take off with you don't know whether the plane was topped off or not, and you're going to fly this trip with only a 30-minute reserve? Come on. Class, believe me, you need a 1-hour reserve, and you're foolish to ever try a flight whenever you're going to have less than an hour reserve when you get there. You need a 1-hour reserve. If I said 30 minutes, I didn't mean it. You need a 1-hour reserve, all right? A 1-hour reserve. Not for the test, though. For the test, put down 30 minutes. It used to be you needed no reserve. This is a new rule. 30 minutes used to be no reserve. And now you need a 30-minute reserve and 45 minutes for night.
If you make such a convincing case of that, why is the FAA so reluctant to do things
I don't know.
for safety?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know why. But, you know, a lot of the FAA's rules are based on your own safety, your own good judgment. This is the absolute minimum. There's some people who would say that's good enough if you have real accurate gauges and real accurate everything. But I just know that we're dealing with general aviation pilots. And you want to remember something. You as general aviation pilots, I would have to say, and most of us deal with automobile mentality. All right? And that means that, you know, you can't go on with this mentality that when it gets to E, you got 2 gallons left like you got in your 88 Oldsmobile. All right? Okay? You know, don't do that. I want to tell you this, class, there is an unbelievable number of fuel starvation accidents. Unbelievable number. Why? The reason is I don't know, but I think it's automobile mentality. Keep in mind, if you learn nothing else from this class but a 1-hour reserve, you've gotten more than your money's worth, believe me. Okay? All right. Let's go over to 9170 aircraft speed. This is in your anyway, aircraft speed. It just says the maximum speed below 10,000, we mentioned yesterday, is 250 knots. Maximum speed in airport traffic area is 156 knots. Over on the next page, page 8, it talks about the aircraft lights. Take a look up here. Aircraft lights. Take a look up here. I want to tell you that the position lights on an airplane have to be on from sunset to sunrise. Here's the position lights on the airplane, the red lights on the left, the green lights on the right, and the white lights on the tail. Take a look up here. Now, these lights have to be on from sunset to sunrise. In other words, when it's just a little dark until morning, all right? Sunset to sunrise. As soon as it starts to get dark, you have to put your position lights on. Now, these lights, by the way, we've got the red one on the left, the green one on the right. I want you to know there's a little shade around them. So that if you're in the back looking at this plane, you can't see the red and the green light because they're shaded. The only one you can see is the white tail light. Now, the airplane also has a red or a strobe light, white possibly, an anti-collision light on here. And what I want you to do is there'll be some questions on the test. It'll say you see a steady white light and a flashing red light. Where is that airplane? He's headed away from you. They might have another one that says you see a green light and a red light and a flashing red light. Where's that airplane? He's headed towards you. Okay? So just keep this in mind. Okay, 9127 and 9131, these have to do with the documents that are required to be on board an airplane. You want to know that there are 3 required documents. This will be on every written test you'll ever take, and your FAA examiner will probably ask you about these to prove the airplane is airworthy. The 3 documents are the airworthiness certificate, looking at the little notes on the side, airworthiness certificate, certificate of registration, and the operating limitations. Now, the airworthiness certificate tells us that the airplane was airworthy when it was new. It has no expiration date on it. All right? Now, the administrator says this certificate is valid. Listen closely. The administrator says this certificate is valid as long as the airplane is maintained as per the regulations. Now, the administrator says that a year after this certificate is issued, 12 calendar months, says the airplane must have had a maintenance inspection, meeting certain requirements. That's called the annual inspection. When that is done, we say that the airworthiness certificate has been reinstated. However, nobody ever touches that airworthiness certificate. Now, a year later, we have to have another annual inspection, and then it gets entered in the logbook that the plane has had this annual inspection. Now, tell me this then. Does anyone ever touch the airworthiness certificate and write OK to fly or anything on it? No. It just sits in that same little plastic pouch forever. Nobody ever touches it. How can we determine if we have a valid airworthiness certificate? That's the question on the test. How can you determine if you have a valid airworthiness certificate, class? You have to check the aircraft and engine logbooks. That's what you have to check. Okay? Now, there's also a certificate of registration, and there's also the operating limitations. Now, the operating limitations, class, take a look up here. This could be one big book called the FAA Approved Flight Manual. Not an owner's manual, FAA Approved Flight Manual. And it's specifically for airplane 1234 Alpha. All right? Now, this has the limitations, maximum airspeeds, minimum airspeeds. It has minimum oil pressures. It has maximum way of putting weight in certain baggage compartments and so on. Sometimes we can get by without an approved flight manual. What we can have is the operating limitations that can be in the form of markings, placards, or any combination thereof that show the operating limitations. But we have to have the operating limitations on board. These are the three documents: airworthiness certificate, certificate of registration, and the operating limitations. Notice down below there it says things that are not required: the aircraft and engine logs, or the owner's manual. Those aren't required. Might be nice to have them, but you don't have to have them. It's kind of funny, but listen to this. Class, when you're flying yourself, do you have to have your pilot logbook with you? No. All you have to have is your license and your medical, and on the airplane you need to have these three documents. Suppose you went in somewhere and you stopped in Omaha, and you ran into Joe FAA there waiting to catch a bus. He says, well, I missed my bus, so he says, I'm going to give you a line check while I'm here. He says, I'd like to do a little ground check here and be sure you got all your documents and you're legal. So you show him your three documents here on the airplane, and you show him your license and medical. He says, well, yeah, I know, but you came in here with passengers. He said, can you prove to me that you've done your 3 bounces in the last 90 days? Say, yeah, it's in my logbook. Okay, let me look at the logbook. Well, sir, the logbook is not here because it's at home. I don't carry it with me. See? So when you take this test, don't answer questions about what you think it ought to be, or what you think it ought to be to demonstrate to the FAA that you meet these requirements of 3 bounces in the last 90 days. You have to say to the FAA, well, yes, sir, I have that logbook at home, and as soon as I get home, I'll make a photocopy of the last page and send that on to you if that's all right. Sure, he says, that'll be okay. He says, well, now, how do I know this plane has had the annual inspection? Well, it's in my logbook. I don't have my logbooks with me, sir, though I keep those at home in my desk drawer. You say, oh, okay, well, when I get home, I'll make a copy of that page and send it to you. So the logbooks do not have to be on board the airplane, just these 3 documents here. Okay, yes,
How does this relate to Aero, or is this the relationship?
Okay. There is this little gouge of Aero. Airworthiness certificate, registration, radio license. Well, radio license is required, but that's by the FCC, so we don't need to talk about that here. Okay. Operating limitations, and then the other said weight and balance. The reason I don't like that Aero is because Aero talks about weight and balance as though it's a separate document. When you say operating limitations, that includes weight and balance, doesn't it? So you're saying something twice, but the gouge Aero is okay. For
And then the only other question I have is, the operating limitations in the 152s that I fly, where would that be?
The operating limitations. It would probably be in the FAA-approved flight manual on board the airplane. Or it might be the weight and balance data clipped together. It might be the FAA-approved yellow marks and red marks on the oil pressure and on the airspeed indicators. It might be the placards in the weight and balance in the baggage compartment saying don't put any more than 120 pounds in this baggage compartment. They may have a combination of markings, placards, and papers that tell us all the operating limitations. Or if they have no markings or placards, they may have just one big thick book that says this is the FAA-approved flight manual with all of the necessary operating limitations in it. Okay, but the limitations have to be there somewhere on that airplane. Okay?
That could be a Cessna operations manual.
It could be, but it has to be specifically for that airplane. All right? Okay, over on the next page, page 91, page 9, Regulation 9129, it talks about another responsibility of the pilot in command. This says that the pilot in command is responsible for determining whether the airplane is in condition for safe flight, whether it's airworthy. That's his responsibility. When you take command of the airplane, it's your job to see that the plane appears airworthy. Not only that, but you should what you should do is you should maybe review the documentation as you feel is necessary to determine the airplane is airworthy. This is the FAA's way of saying, hey, you accepted that airplane, and you must have determined it's airworthy because that's a regulation. Right? So that's your responsibility to determine the airplane is airworthy.